Picture a map where the sun never sets, a quarter of the entire planet's landmass, hundreds of millions of people, from the frozen tundras of Canada to the sweltering ports of Bombay, all answering to a small, damp island in the North Atlantic. How did a nation the size of Britain, smaller than the state of Oregon, come to command the largest empire the world has ever known? This is not a story of simple luck. It is a story of ships and steel, of merchants and monarchs, of brutal ambition and accidental genius. This is the story of how the British Empire came to rule the world. The story of British dominance does not begin with cannons or conquest, it begins with water. Britain is an island, cut off from the European continent by a channel that has, for 1,000 years, been both a shield and a highway. While continental powers like France, Austria, and Prussia poured their treasuries into standing armies to defend their long land borders, Britain had the luxury of geography. It needed no vast army to guard its frontiers, because the sea was its frontier. What it needed instead was a navy, and it built one obsessively, for centuries, until no rival fleet could challenge it on open water. This maritime focus became a national identity in the 16th century, during the reign of Henry VIII, who transformed a modest medieval fleet into the beginnings of a professional royal navy. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would inherit a kingdom perched precariously between Catholic Spain and Catholic France, a Protestant island surrounded by hostile powers. In 1588, Spain sent the largest invasion fleet Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada, to crush England and restore Catholic rule. What followed was not just a military victory but a psychological turning point. English ships, faster and more maneuverable than the lumbering Spanish galleons, harried the Armada up the Channel, and a providential storm did the rest, scattering the remaining Spanish vessels along the Irish coast. England had defeated the greatest empire of the age, and it had done so at sea. This victory did more than preserve English independence, it planted an idea. If a smaller navy of agile, well-handled ships could defeat a larger, more cumbersome one, then naval supremacy was not simply a matter of size, but of technique, discipline, and innovation. English shipwrights began refining designs, favoring speed and cannon placement over the towering, top-heavy structures favored by Iberian powers. Meanwhile, a new class of English sailors, men like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, combined piracy, exploration, and state-sanctioned plunder into a single enterprise. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 was as much a treasure raid against Spanish shipping as it was an act of exploration, and it returned Elizabeth's government a profit so enormous that some historians estimate it alone funded the modernization of the English fleet. But ships and sailors were only half the equation. The other half was capital, and here, England developed an institutional innovation that would prove just as decisive as any warship, the Joint Stock Company. Traditional trade expeditions were ruinously risky, a single lost ship could bankrupt a merchant family. The joint stock model allowed investors to pool capital and share risk across many ships and many voyages, spreading catastrophic losses across a wide base of shareholders while concentrating the potential rewards. This financial technology, still primitive in the 1600s, would eventually evolve into the engine of the entire empire. In 1600, Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, creating the English East India Company, initially a modest venture chartered to compete with Dutch and Portuguese traders for the immensely lucrative spice trade of Southeast Asia. Few at the time could have imagined that this trading company, answerable to shareholders rather than the crown, would one day command its own private army larger than many European states, and would eventually govern the Indian subcontinent itself. But in these earliest decades, the company was simply one player among many in a crowded, dangerous marketplace, competing against the far more established Dutch East India Company, which dominated the East Indies spice trade with ruthless efficiency. England's early colonial ventures in the Americas were similarly humble and often disastrous. The Roanoke colony, founded in 1585, vanished without explanation, becoming one of history's most enduring mysteries. Jamestown, founded in 1607 in Virginia, nearly collapsed multiple times from starvation, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, surviving only through a combination of luck, resupply, and the accidental discovery that tobacco, a crop with a growing addiction-driven market in Europe, could be cultivated profitably on Virginia soil. Tobacco would become the economic lifeline of early English America, demonstrating a pattern that would repeat throughout the empire's history. Colonies justified themselves not through glory, but through profit. By the mid-17th century, England had established a patchwork of colonies along the American Atlantic coast, in the Caribbean, and trading posts in India and West Africa. None of this constituted an empire, in any grand imperial sense. It was fragmented, underfunded, and often chaotic, riddled with corporate rivalries, colonial mismanagement, and the ever-present threat of Dutch, French, and Spanish competition. What England did possess, however, was a uniquely favorable combination of factors: a navy hardened by decades of conflict, a legal and financial system that could mobilize private capital for risky ventures, a parliament that, unlike most European monarchies, placed constraints on royal spending and encouraged commercial interests to shape policy, and a population of restless, often religiously persecuted settlers willing to cross an ocean for opportunity or freedom. It was during the tumultuous 17th century, a century that saw England undergo civil war, the execution of a king, a republican experiment under Oliver Cromwell, and the eventual restoration of the monarchy, that the machinery of empire truly began to take shape. Cromwell's government, despite its domestic upheavals, pursued an aggressively mercantilist foreign policy, passing the Navigation Acts in 1651, which required that goods imported into England or its colonies be carried on English ships. This was a direct assault on Dutch commercial dominance, which relied heavily on serving as the shipping middlemen of Europe. The resulting Anglo-Dutch wars, fought across the 1650s, 1660s, and 1670s, gradually eroded Dutch commercial supremacy and allowed England to seize key colonial possessions, including New Amsterdam, renamed New York in 1664. By the close of the 17th century, England, soon to become Great Britain following the 1707 Act of Union with Scotland, had assembled the essential preconditions for imperial expansion, naval capability, financial innovation, a legal framework favorable to commerce, and colonial footholds across multiple continents. The stage was set not yet for an empire that ruled the world, but for one that was about to begin competing for it in earnest, against the two great rival powers of the age, France and the Netherlands. If the 17th century laid the foundations of British maritime and commercial power, the 18th century was when Britain transformed that foundation into a genuine global trading empire, one built not on romantic notions of exploration, but on the harder, darker machinery of commerce, credit, and coercion. At the heart of this transformation lay a system historians now call the Atlantic economy, or more starkly, the triangular trade: British manufactured goods shipped to West Africa in exchange for enslaved people, who were then transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions to the Caribbean and American colonies, where their forced labor produced sugar, tobacco, and cotton that were shipped back to Britain to fuel manufacturing and consumption. This system, responsible for immense suffering and the forced displacement of millions of Africans, generated staggering profits that financed ports, banks, insurance markets, and industries across Britain, particularly in cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow. The scale of this trade cannot be overstated in its economic significance to British expansion. Sugar, cultivated on Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved labor, became one of the most valuable commodities in the entire British economic system by the early 18th century, rivaling and at times surpassing the value of all other colonial exports combined. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar colonies like Jamaica and Barbados funded infrastructure, elegant townhouses, and financial institutions throughout Britain, while simultaneously entrenching a brutal plantation economy that would not be legally abolished within the empire until 1833, and even then, compensation was paid not to the enslaved, but to the slaveholders themselves. While the Atlantic system generated capital, it was in Asia that the East India Company was quietly transforming from a trading concern into something far more unusual, a corporate sovereign. Throughout the early 18th century, the company expanded its network of fortified trading posts, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, competing directly with French, Dutch, and Portuguese rivals for access to Indian textiles, which were, at the time, more technically advanced and more desired in European markets than anything Britain itself produced. Indian calicos and muslins were so popular that English textile manufacturers successfully lobbied Parliament for protectionist bans on imported Indian cloth, a telling sign that Britain's industrial advantages were not yet established. The decisive turning point in India came through conflict rather than commerce. As the Mughal Empire, which had long dominated the subcontinent, weakened through internal succession disputes and regional fragmentation, a power vacuum opened that both the British and French East India Companies sought to exploit by allying with rival regional rulers. This rivalry culminated in a series of conflicts across the mid-18th century, most famously the 1757 Battle of Plassey in Bengal, where company forces under Robert Clive, combining military force with political bribery and the defection of key opposing commanders, defeated the Nawab of Bengal. This victory gave the East India Company effective control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions in the world, and marked the beginning of a shift from trading enterprise to territorial empire. Within a decade, the company held the Diwani, the right to collect tax revenue, over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, transforming a commercial entity into a taxing, governing power over tens of millions of people, all without any direct oversight from the British Parliament or Crown. This blurring of corporate and imperial power would define British expansion in India for the following century, as the company steadily expanded its territorial control through a combination of direct conquest, subsidiary alliances that reduced regional rulers to dependent client status, and administrative reforms designed to maximize revenue extraction. Critics in Britain, including the statesman Edmund Burke, would later condemn the company's conduct in India as a form of corporate misrule characterized by corruption and exploitation, leading Parliament to pass increasingly restrictive regulatory acts throughout the later 18th century in an attempt to bring the company under greater governmental oversight. Meanwhile, Britain's rivalry with France intensified into a series of global conflicts that historians consider a genuine world war fought a century before the term became common. The 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763 across Europe, North America, India, and the high seas, proved to be a defining moment in the establishment of British global supremacy. In North America, the conflict, known there as the French and Indian War, saw British forces, alongside colonial militias, decisively defeat French forces and their Native American allies, culminating in the capture of Quebec in 1759 and the eventual French cession of nearly all its North American territories east of the Mississippi River under the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Simultaneously, in India, British forces further weakened French colonial ambitions, cementing British dominance on the subcontinent. The 7 Years' War left Britain as the preeminent global colonial power, but it also left the British government deeply in debt, having financed a war fought on multiple continents simultaneously. In an attempt to recoup these costs, Parliament imposed a series of taxes on its American colonies, including the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1767, provoking fierce colonial resistance grounded in the principle that taxation without direct parliamentary representation was illegitimate. This escalating conflict between colonial assemblies and the British government would culminate in the American Revolutionary War, beginning in 1775, and the eventual loss of 13 American colonies with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, a profound imperial humiliation that many contemporaries believed signaled the beginning of the end for British colonial ambitions altogether. Remarkably, the loss of the American colonies did not cripple the empire but instead redirected its ambitions. Britain increasingly focused its colonial energies eastward, toward India and the Pacific, and toward a new and different model of empire, one built less on settler colonies of British emigrants and more on the direct administration and economic exploitation of existing, densely populated societies. In 1770, Captain James Cook charted the eastern coastline of Australia, claiming it for Britain, and within 2 decades the first British penal colony was established at Botany Bay, beginning a new chapter of colonization in the Pacific even as the American chapter closed. By the century's end, Britain governed a fundamentally different kind of empire than it had in 1700, less reliant on settler agriculture, increasingly centered on the administration of Asian territories, and financed by a combination of industrial manufacturing, which was just beginning its transformative rise, and the continued, brutal machinery of Atlantic slavery. The 19th century was the century in which the British Empire transformed from merely the largest of several competing colonial powers into something unprecedented in human history, a globe-spanning system of territorial control, economic dominance, and military supremacy so vast that contemporaries coined the phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets." The engine driving this transformation was not simply naval power or commercial ambition, though both remained essential, but an entirely new force that had begun quietly reshaping Britain itself, industrialization. Beginning in the late 18th century and accelerating dramatically through the 19th, Britain underwent an economic and technological revolution unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. Innovations in textile manufacturing, particularly mechanized spinning and weaving powered first by water and then by steam engines, allowed British factories to produce cloth at a volume and cost that no other nation, and certainly no traditional handicraft economy, could match. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in the 1770s and 1780s provided a source of mechanical power independent of geography, allowing factories to be built wherever coal and capital converged rather than only alongside fast-flowing rivers. Britain possessed abundant coal reserves, a banking system capable of financing large-scale industrial investment, and crucially, colonial markets and raw material sources, including Indian cotton and, controversially, American slave-grown cotton, that fed this industrial machine. This industrial transformation had profound and often devastating consequences for Britain's colonial relationships, nowhere more starkly illustrated than in India. Whereas India had once exported finished textiles to Britain, the relationship inverted over the course of the 19th century. British mechanized textile production undercut Indian handloom weavers so severely that entire traditional industries collapsed, and India was increasingly reduced to exporting raw cotton to British mills while importing British-manufactured cloth. This pattern, in which colonies supplied raw materials while the metropole retained manufacturing and profit, became a defining structural feature of what economic historians describe as Britain's informal and formal imperial economy throughout the Victorian era. Political control over India itself underwent a dramatic transformation at mid-century. In 1857, a widespread and violent uprising against East India Company rule erupted, beginning among Indian soldiers, or sepoys, serving in the company's army, and rapidly spreading into a broader rebellion involving deposed rulers, landowners, and civilians across northern and central India. The rebellion, known variously as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the First War of Indian Independence, was suppressed by British forces after more than a year of brutal fighting on both sides, involving significant atrocities. In its aftermath, the British Parliament abolished East India Company rule entirely, transferring direct governance of India to the British Crown through the Government of India Act of 1858. In 1877, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, formalizing what became known as the British Raj, direct imperial administration over the Indian subcontinent that would last until Indian independence in 1947. Simultaneously, the Royal Navy's dominance reached an apex that historians describe as unmatched by any previous or subsequent naval power relative to its era. Following the decisive 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, in which Admiral Horatio Nelson's fleet destroyed the combined French and Spanish navies, no rival power seriously challenged British naval supremacy for the remainder of the century. This unchallenged control of the seas allowed Britain to enforce what became known as the Pax Britannica, a period of relative great power peace in Europe during which Britain used its naval dominance to protect global shipping lanes, suppress piracy, and, after 1807, enforce its own abolition of the Atlantic slave trade against other nations' shipping, even as slavery itself persisted for decades in territories including the United States and Brazil. The mid to late 19th century also witnessed what historians term the scramble for Africa, a rapid and often arbitrary partition of the African continent among European powers, formalized at the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, where European negotiators divided African territory among themselves with little regard for existing ethnic, linguistic, or political boundaries. Britain emerged from this scramble controlling a vast swath of African territory, including Egypt, following its 1882 occupation ostensibly to protect the strategically vital Suez Canal, as well as Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Kenya, Rhodesia, and ultimately, following the brutal 1899–1902 Boer War against Afrikaner settler republics, the territories that would become South Africa. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate and colonial administrator, articulated an explicit vision of a continuous British-controlled corridor, from Cape to Cairo, reflecting the scale of ambition that characterized this era of imperial expansion. Underpinning this territorial expansion was a set of technological advantages that gave European militaries, and British forces in particular, a decisive edge over local resistance across Africa and Asia. The development of the Maxim gun in the 1880s, the first practical fully automatic machine gun, gave small British colonial forces an overwhelming firepower advantage in numerous colonial conflicts. Similarly, advances in tropical medicine, particularly the growing understanding of quinine's effectiveness in preventing malaria, allowed European soldiers and administrators to survive and operate in tropical African environments that had previously proven lethal to non-immune populations, removing what had been one of the most significant natural barriers to European colonization of the African interior. Communication and transportation technologies further bound this sprawling empire together in ways that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. The laying of transoceanic telegraph cables throughout the latter half of the 19th century allowed London to communicate with colonial administrators in India or Australia within hours rather than the months previously required by shipborne mail. Railways, extensively constructed throughout British India, Africa, and other territories, facilitated both military deployment and the efficient extraction of raw materials for export. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869 and in which Britain acquired a controlling financial interest in 1875, dramatically shortened the sea route between Britain and its Asian territories, reinforcing the strategic and economic centrality of the empire's eastern possessions. By the close of the 19th century, the British Empire encompassed roughly a quarter of the world's total land area and governed an even larger proportion of its population, spanning 6 continents and incorporating an extraordinary diversity of legal systems, religions, and administrative arrangements. From direct crown colonies to self-governing dominions like Canada and Australia to the complex princely state system of India. This was not a uniform or centrally planned empire but rather a sprawling, often contradictory accumulation of territories acquired through commerce, conquest, treaty, and circumstance over 3 centuries, yet by 1900, it stood as the largest empire the world had ever seen, its power resting on the combined foundations of naval supremacy, industrial capacity, financial sophistication, and technological military advantage. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at the summit of its global power, yet the very century that opened with British dominance so total it seemed almost permanent would also witness that dominance unravel with striking speed. Understanding both how the empire sustained itself at its peak, and why it ultimately declined, reveals as much about the nature of imperial power as its original construction did. The administrative genius of the late empire lay in its remarkable flexibility of governance. Rather than imposing a single uniform system across its vastly different territories, Britain developed a spectrum of colonial arrangements tailored to local circumstances and strategic priorities. Self-governing dominions such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually South Africa were granted increasing autonomy over domestic affairs while remaining tied to Britain through shared monarchy, trade preferences, and military cooperation, a relationship formalized through the 1926 Balfour Declaration and the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which recognized these dominions as fully autonomous communities within what became known as the British Commonwealth. Crown colonies, by contrast, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, remained under more direct British administrative control, governed by appointed governors with limited local representation. India occupied a unique intermediate category, governed through an elaborate colonial bureaucracy, the Indian Civil Service, staffed by a relatively small number of British administrators who nonetheless exercised authority over hundreds of millions of people, often relying heavily on existing local power structures, including princely rulers who retained nominal sovereignty over roughly a third of Indian territory under British paramountcy. This system of indirect rule, particularly prevalent in Africa, allowed Britain to govern vast populations with a remarkably small number of British personnel by co-opting, transforming, or sometimes inventing traditional local authority structures and channeling them toward imperial administrative purposes. While this approach reduced administrative costs, it also entrenched and sometimes exacerbated ethnic and social divisions that would leave lasting and often destabilizing legacies following decolonization. The First World War, beginning in 1914, marked a profound turning point for the empire, even in victory. Britain mobilized colonial resources on an extraordinary scale, drawing soldiers and laborers from across India, Africa, and the Caribbean, alongside dominant contributions from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, whose forces suffered catastrophic casualties at engagements including Gallipoli and the Western Front. This wartime mobilization simultaneously demonstrated the empire's global reach and accelerated demands for greater autonomy and self-determination among colonial populations who had sacrificed so heavily for a war fought primarily over European rivalries. India's wartime contributions, in particular, fueled a rapidly growing nationalist movement, led increasingly by figures such as Mohandas Gandhi, whose campaigns of nonviolent civil disobedience throughout the 1920s and 1930s posed an entirely new kind of challenge to British colonial authority, one that proved far more difficult to suppress through conventional military force than earlier armed uprisings had been. The interwar period also saw the empire reach its absolute maximum territorial extent, as Britain acquired administrative control over former German and Ottoman territories through League of Nations mandates following the First World War, including Palestine, Iraq, and Tanganyika. Yet this territorial peak masked increasingly severe underlying strains. The enormous financial costs of the war had left Britain deeply indebted. Its industrial and naval advantages were being steadily eroded by the rising economic power of the United States and, in different ways, by Japan and Germany. And colonial nationalist movements were gaining organizational sophistication and popular support across the empire, from India to Egypt to the Caribbean. The Second World War delivered a far more decisive blow to imperial sustainability than the first had. Although Britain and its empire ultimately emerged victorious, the financial and material costs of the conflict were staggering, effectively bankrupting Britain and rendering it dependent on American financial support through arrangements including Lend-Lease and post-war loans. Perhaps even more significantly, the war exposed the fragility of British imperial military power in Asia, where Japanese forces achieved a series of stunning victories against British colonial forces, including the catastrophic fall of Singapore in 1942, an event that shattered the myth of European invincibility in the eyes of colonized populations across Asia and accelerated post-war demands for independence. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the British Empire began a process of decolonization that proceeded with a speed few had anticipated. India and Pakistan achieved independence in 1947, following intensified nationalist agitation and Britain's own recognition that continued rule had become financially and politically unsustainable, though the partition of the subcontinent was accompanied by horrific communal violence and mass displacement. Throughout the following 2 decades, colony after colony across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean achieved independence, often through negotiated transitions of power but sometimes, as in Kenya and Malaya, following prolonged and violent insurgencies against continued British rule. By the 1960s and 1970s, the British Empire had contracted to a small collection of remaining overseas territories, its once vast global reach reduced to a fraction of its earlier extent. The legacy of this 3-century imperial project remains one of the most contested subjects in historical scholarship, and reasonable historians continue to disagree sharply on how to weigh its consequences. Some scholarship emphasizes the empire's role in spreading English language, common law legal traditions, parliamentary institutions, and infrastructure including railways and telegraph networks across much of the world, arguing these left durable institutional benefits in many former colonies. Other scholarship emphasizes the immense human costs of the imperial project, including the devastation of the transatlantic slave trade, the economic exploitation and deindustrialization of colonized economies such as India's textile sector, the violent suppression of resistance movements, the arbitrary drawing of colonial borders that fueled subsequent conflicts, and catastrophic famines, including in British-ruled Bengal and Ireland, whose severity was substantially worsened by colonial administrative policy. Contemporary historians increasingly argue that any honest assessment of the British Empire must hold both dimensions in view simultaneously, recognizing that the same imperial system capable of building railways and codifying legal systems was also responsible for immense exploitation, violence, and suffering across the territories it controlled. What remains undeniable is the scale of the transformation the empire wrought upon the modern world, the global spread of the English language, the redrawing of political boundaries across multiple continents, the establishment of global trade networks whose patterns persist today, and a legacy of colonial relationships whose economic, political, and cultural consequences continue to shape international affairs nearly 8 decades after the empire's most rapid period of dissolution began.